This escort carrier was racing to support the beachhead when enemy battleship turrets rose on the horizon. Once she was singled out, she would go down, and her escorts had only smoke and torpedoes to charge the guns and buy her a few minutes. A little after dawn on October 25, 1944, the United States Navy Escort Carrier Support Group was launching aircraft for the fighting on Leyte. The escort carriers turned into the wind, sent planes off the deck, then turned away again to make speed. Destroyers and destroyer escorts held a wide screen ahead and to the sides. The group was built for close support, not a surface fight against battleships. The escort carriers carried aircraft fuel and bombs on thinly protected decks. A heavy shell that reached a flight deck could tear open fuel lines, scatter burning fragments, and stop launching in one strike. The escorts could hide carriers behind smoke and threaten with torpedoes, but they could not trade heavy gunfire for long. Reports came in from the forward lookouts. At first, the words were cautious. A line on the horizon, tall shapes, more than one. Rain squalls broke the view and the light was flat. One ship said the shapes might be friendly ships moving in the same area. Another ship said the silhouettes were wrong. Then the shapes gained edges. The towers were too tall. The masts were too many. The bridge of the group flagship went quiet, while officers checked and rechecked what their eyes were telling them. In that pause, no one argued over who had made the first call. They argued over what they had time to do before the first accurate salvo. A staff officer traced bearings on a plot with a pencil. A second ship confirmed the contact. The message did not carry drama. It carried weight. The enemy was a main surface force with heavy guns and the speed to close. The group commander moved straight to the problem that would kill them if he avoided it. His escort carriers could not outrun battleships and cruisers for long. His escort carriers also could not stop launching aircraft because aircraft were the only weapons in his force that could reach the enemy without being shattered in return. To keep launching, the carriers had to turn into the wind, and that turn cost speed and made their course predictable. To run, the carriers had to point away and accept that aircraft already in the air would circle with fuel burning down while the deck stayed at the wrong angle for recovery. A ship's signal clock ticked on the bulkhead. The commander did not stare at it, but his orders proved he heard it. He chose to spend small ships to buy minutes for big decks. He gave short orders. The escort carriers were to turn away and build as much speed as they could. They were to keep launching aircraft no matter what those aircraft carried. The screen was to lay smoke between the enemy and the carriers. The destroyers were to go forward, threaten with torpedoes, and make the enemy maneuver. Those orders hit every deck at once. On one escort carrier, the flight deck officer looked at the first aircraft in line. Some aircraft had been prepared for land targets. Some were still being fueled. A pilot at the head of the line waited with his canopy open, looking down at crewmen who were still tightening straps and checking pins. The flight deck officer did not wait for the last check. He cut the checklist short with a hand signal that meant one thing: go. Deck crews pulled chocks and waved propellers into motion. Engines started and shook the deck. The first aircraft rolled, lifted, and vanished into low cloud. The second followed. The third followed. Each launch was a gamble. Every plane that left the deck was one less plane that could be destroyed by a shell burst on the flight deck. Every plane that stayed was one more plane that might burn where it sat. Down in the radio room, a talker leaned over the microphone and passed position reports. The words were tight. Bearings changed quickly. The range was closing. Another ship reported muzzle flashes on the horizon. The first heavy shells were already in the air. Across the screen, destroyer captains ordered smoke. Crewmen opened valves and thick smoke poured aft. Another destroyer did the same. At first, the smoke was separate trails. Then the wind pulled them together into a wall. The wall was not meant to hide the carriers forever. It was meant to break the enemy's ability to measure, correct, and keep pouring shells onto the same target. The first salvos landed short, then long. Water rose in columns. Steel fragments hissed down over decks. The destroyers were not armored. Even near misses could cut men down. Still, the destroyers kept moving, because stopping would make the next salvo more accurate and would turn a near miss into a direct hit. One destroyer escort signaled that it had splinter damage and small fires. Its captain asked whether to fall back. The answer came back in plain language: stay in the screen. Keep smoke between the enemy and the carriers. Keep moving. On an escort carrier, the captain looked aft and saw smoke drifting across his wake. He also saw aircraft still on deck and aircraft already returning overhead, circling because they had nowhere else to go. He made choices in short bursts. Turn to launch, turn away to run, turn back into the wind again. Each change saved one problem and created another. Each change kept the ship alive for one more minute. The group commander understood that the carriers could not live on smoke and turns alone. Smoke bought minutes, not safety. The enemy could still close, and the enemy could still fire through gaps when the wind tore the screen open. If the heavy ship settled into a steady rhythm, the escort carriers would be picked off one by one, and the pilots circling overhead would watch their decks disappear. He needed the enemy to feel a different threat, one that forced heavy ships to maneuver instead of keeping their bows pointed at the carriers. That threat was the torpedo. A destroyer that came close enough to launch torpedoes carried a large decision in a small hull. If it launched, the enemy would have to turn to avoid. Turning would break line of fire, break formation, and break speed. If the destroyer failed, it would be crushed under heavy gunfire. The destroyer captain understood that when he ordered the run. Aircraft reached the enemy ships. Pilots saw grey hulls and tall superstructures through breaks in weather. They did not have time to study names. They saw shell splashes walking toward the carriers behind them. They called back what mattered. Large ships, many of them. They were firing fast. Some pilots reported that the enemy fire shifted when aircraft came in, even when the aircraft had little to drop. Some pilots carried bombs, some carried rockets, some carried only machine guns. Even the pilots with light weapons did not turn away. They pushed down into attack angles that forced the enemy to react. They made passes that did not always hit, but they made the enemy ships throw up anti-aircraft fire and shift course. Each shift changed what the enemy gunners could see and how long they could hold a steady solution. Back on the surface, the destroyers began to act on the part of the plan meant for them alone. The United States Navy destroyer Johnston moved first. Its commanding officer was Ernest Evans. He did not wait for a perfect alignment. He watched the carriers behind him and the heavy ships ahead. He knew the carriers could not take heavy shells for long. He also knew that if he pressed forward, he might not come back. Evans gave a short order. Increase speed. Make smoke. Head for the enemy. Johnston surged out of the screen and into open water between smoke banks. Men at the guns held on while the ship leaned into turns. The torpedo crew checked settings with hands that stayed steady because there was no use in shaking. Gun crews opened fire when they had targets, not to win a duel, but to make the enemy look at them and to force the enemy to spread attention across more than one ship. Enemy shells answered almost at once. Water columns rose close enough to slap the ship. Splinters rattled across steel. Johnston kept going. Every yard forward pulled enemy eyes and enemy fire away from the escort carriers. Every yard forward also cut the margin for survival. Behind Johnston, other escorts faced the same choice: stay close and hope smoke held, or move forward and force the enemy to react. In that moment, the screen stopped being only a shield. It became a spear. The sea between the carriers and the enemy filled with smoke and spray. Flight decks kept moving under running men and turning aircraft. Radio talkers kept passing bearings that changed too fast. The group commander watched the smoke thin in places as the wind shifted. He watched dark shapes push closer through gaps. Johnston vanished into one of those gaps, heading straight for the heavy ships. That movement changed the battle. It also narrowed the time left to save the carriers. The destroyer was now close enough that a torpedo launch could force a turn, or a single heavy salvo could end it. The next minutes would decide which. Johnston burst out of the smoke at full speed. Ernest Evans kept the ship pointed at the nearest tall silhouettes and did not wait for the enemy to settle its aim. Shell splashes were already walking toward the escort carriers behind him. If the heavy ships found a steady rhythm, the thin flight decks would not last. The first heavy salvo aimed at Johnston landed close. A wall of water slapped over the bow and swept aft. Steel fragments rattled down across the deck. Men at the guns ducked without stepping away. The ship kept closing because a turn away would give the enemy an easier solution. Evans wanted one outcome, and it had a simple shape. He wanted torpedoes in the water. A destroyer could not trade shells with battleships and cruisers. A destroyer could make them turn. A turn would break fire control and bend the formation. A bent formation would buy minutes. He ordered the torpedo crews to ready the tubes. The torpedo officer called out range and angle. The numbers slid fast as Johnston zigged to stay alive and still close. Evans watched for the short moment when the firing line would exist. Enemy shells kept arriving. Some fell short, some fell long. One burst close enough to throw spray over the bridge windows. The bridge went white for a breath, then cleared. Evans was still driving in. Johnston's guns opened fire through breaks in smoke. 5-inch shells could not crack heavy armor like a battleship shell, but they could hit exposed stations and force attention. Gun crews worked by rhythm. Load, ram, fire, eject, load again. The ship shook with its own gunfire and shook harder when the enemy answered. The range tightened. The enemy ships gained edges, towers, and long gun barrels. Johnston was now close enough that the enemy could not pretend she was a harmless escort. That was the point. The torpedo officer called the window. Evans gave the order. Compressed air drove the torpedoes out. They hit the sea with flat slaps and ran low, leaving thin wakes aimed at the heavy ships. Evans turned hard away the instant the last torpedo left. Staying straight would let the enemy walk shells onto his track with simple corrections. On the enemy line, the reaction came fast. A large ship swung its bow. Another ship followed. Ships behind them began to bend away. The heavy guns paused, then came back less steady because the gunners had lost their clean solution. That pause did not end the danger, it only changed it. The enemy fire that had been reaching for the escort carriers now hunted for the destroyer that had forced the turn. Shells chased Johnston through spray and smoke. A near miss punched the hull with pressure. Men inside the ship felt the deck jump under their boots. A fragment tore into metal and started a small fire. Damage control teams ran with hoses and extinguishers. On a destroyer, a small fire could grow fast when splinters had opened compartments. A runner reached the bridge with a report that a gun mount was damaged. Evans shifted fire to what still worked and kept moving. He did not slow. He did not turn back to hide. He stayed where the enemy had to keep thinking about him. Behind Johnston, the escort carrier support group used the torpedo turn the only way it could. The escort carriers kept turning into the wind to launch aircraft, then turning away to run. Every turn into the wind stole speed and offered the enemy a predictable path. Every turn away delayed launches and made it harder for aircraft to return. On one flight deck, the deck officer waved the next plane forward before the crew had finished a perfect load. Pilots did not argue. They shoved throttles up and took the short run they had. Each aircraft that left the deck was one less aircraft that could burn on the deck if a shell burst came in. Radio talkers passed blunt reports. The enemy was still close. Shell splashes were still rising around the carriers through holes in smoke. The wind tore the smoke screen in places, then shoved it into thick banks in others. The screen had to be rebuilt over and over. Destroyers and destroyer escorts poured smoke into the gaps. One small ship turned toward a widening hole without waiting for orders and laid a thick trail right where the enemy had a clear line. That turn pulled her closer to the heavy ships. It also hid a carrier for another few minutes. The enemy adapted. Once the heavy captains realized small ships were charging, some shifted fire off the escort carriers and onto the attackers. That shift saved flight decks. It also meant the destroyers started taking the full weight of heavy guns. Johnston came out of her hard turn and pushed back toward the enemy through another break in smoke. Evans had fired his torpedoes, but the torpedo threat was still alive. The enemy did not know how many torpedoes remained on the other escorts. The enemy had to assume more were coming. That assumption became the Americans' main weapon. They could not sink battleships with destroyers. They could make battleships act as if they were vulnerable. Overhead, the first American aircraft arrived low and fast. Pilots saw large hulls turning through squalls and smoke, firing at targets the pilots could not always see. Some aircraft carried bombs meant for land. Some carried rockets. Some carried little more than machine guns. They attacked anyway. A pilot pushed down into a pass that forced anti-aircraft fire up at him. He pulled out with his aircraft shaking from near bursts. He looked back and saw a heavy ship swing again, not because a bomb hit, but because the captain did not want to hold a steady course under repeated dives. Each forced swing cost the enemy gunners time. On the surface, a second destroyer surged out of smoke and angled toward the enemy. A third followed on a different line. Their goal was not to die in the same place. Their goal was to make the enemy split attention across multiple threats and lose the ability to concentrate fire. The sea filled with columns of water and drifting smoke. In that mess, communication became a weapon and a liability. Radios were crowded with reports and requests. Some sets were damaged. Some captains limited transmissions because talking stole seconds from looking. Smoke made it hard to see who was where. A captain might see a shadow and not know if it was a friendly ship cutting across his bow or an enemy cruiser pushing in. One destroyer began a torpedo run, then pulled off because a friendly silhouette crossed the line. The captain held fire rather than risk striking his own. The hesitation cost distance. Enemy shells found him closer than he wanted. A burst sprayed fragments across his deck. A sailor at a gun shield dropped. Another sailor stepped into the place without looking down. Johnston took heavier attention. An enemy cruiser found her with a tighter pattern. Shells walked closer. One hit with a crack that sounded different from near misses. Johnston shuddered. Inside, men felt the pressure change that meant compartments had been opened. Damage control teams moved without waiting. They slammed watertight doors. They set shoring timbers. They checked for flooding and fire. They did not ask whether the ship would survive. They asked what could be kept working for the next 10 minutes. Evans stayed on the bridge and kept Johnston in motion. Some guns had gone silent. Others still fired when targets appeared in gaps. Johnston zigged, then zagged, and laid what smoke she could. She remained a moving problem the enemy had to solve. Elsewhere, the cost began to concentrate. A small ship in the screen took a heavy hit forward. Metal tore open. Flame and smoke rose. The ship slowed and began to list. The captain tried to keep speed to avoid a clean follow-up salvo, but the ship would not answer like before. Another salvo landed close. The list increased. The captain gave the order to prepare to abandon ship. Men went to stations they had practiced. Life jackets came out. Rafts were cut free. Wounded men were dragged toward the side that still sat higher out of the water. A sailor tried to lift a friend whose leg would not work. Another grabbed the friend's belt and hauled him the last steps. The ship kept one gun firing as long as it could. The shots were not going to sink a battleship. The shots were meant to keep the enemy looking at the wrong target for 1 more minute. Then the gun went silent. Men went over the side. The water took them hard. Oil spread in a thin sheen. Rain stung faces. Some men found rafts, some found debris. They looked back and watched their ship settle, then slip away. They did not have time to mourn. They had to keep heads up and hands moving, because cold water does not wait. A nearby escort edged toward the survivors, then stopped. Shell splashes were still landing in that patch of sea. Stopping would make the escort a fixed target. The captain turned back into smoke and marked the position. If the carriers lived, he would come back. On the escort carriers, the flight decks became a second front. Aircraft that had launched early were coming back with fuel low. Some had fired everything. Some had nothing left to drop. They still needed a deck. A carrier captain listened to reports in short bursts. Enemy shells were falling closer through gaps. A pilot overhead had minutes of fuel. Smoke was thinning again. The enemy line was still near. The captain chose distance over recovery for the moment. He kept the ship on a course that built separation. He ordered more launches when the wind allowed. He accepted that some pilots might have to find another deck or put aircraft into the sea. Pilots did not waste time arguing on the radio. They asked for headings. They asked for any ship that could take them. They watched fuel gauges and then looked back down at the enemy, because each pass still forced the enemy to move. Deck crews took near misses as work orders. A near miss threw a sheet of water across a deck edge and knocked men down. Men got up and dragged a damaged aircraft clear so the next one could roll. They kept doing it because stopping meant losing the only weapon the carriers had. In the smoke and squalls, The fight turned into separate rooms. Ships appeared and vanished. The enemy could not see the full American group. The Americans could not see the full enemy. Both sides began acting on partial pictures. For the American escorts, partial pictures were dangerous, but they were also shelter. The heavy ships were built to win with measured fire and clear targets. When targets disappeared, their advantage shrank. When torpedoes might be in the water, captains turned even when they hated turning. When aircraft kept diving, formations could not settle. A destroyer escort lost sight of the carriers completely. Its captain faced a choice. He could keep running on the course he guessed was safe and hope the carriers were there. Or he could turn toward the gun flashes and risk being alone in front of the heavy ships. He turned toward the flashes. He laid smoke as he went. He fired when targets appeared because the carriers could not afford for the screen to drift away. The cost of that choice spread across the water. Another small ship took damage severe enough to slow. Fire hoses lost pressure when lines were cut. The captain tried to turn behind smoke and keep the ship afloat. Rising smoke gave away the position. Enemy shells found the ship again. The list increased. The captain ordered abandon ship. Men went into the water in groups. They pushed rafts free and helped the wounded first when they could. When they could not, they made choices that felt like betrayal, even when they were the only choices left. A man in the water watched a friendly ship pass through smoke and not stop. He understood why. He also understood he might now be alone for a long time. He gripped a raft edge and kicked to keep his legs working. He kept his eyes on the sky for American aircraft. He kept his eyes on the horizon for gun flashes, because the battle was still close enough to kill him. On the ship still moving, no one forgot the men in the water. No one could act on it yet. Every captain still afloat had the same job: keep the escort carriers alive long enough to escape and keep supporting Leyte. Near the later part of the fight, an aircraft overhead called in a change. The pilot reported that the enemy ships did not seem to be pressing as hard. Some were changing course. The salvos were less steady. The formation looked bent and uncertain as it moved through the rain. The group commander did not celebrate. A change could be retreat. A change could be a move to cut the carriers off. A change could be a regroup for a cleaner run. He ordered the smoke to continue. He ordered aircraft to keep attacking as long as fuel allowed. He ordered the remaining destroyers and destroyer escorts to pull back toward the carriers when they could. The screen was thinning, and the carriers could not survive if the last escorts died in front of them. Johnston was still out there in the smoke, scarred and slowed, refusing to let the enemy settle. Evans kept his ship in the enemy's view as long as he could. He could feel the battle shifting from a hard push to a dangerous question. He could not tell if the heavy ships were leaving or shaping a trap. The answer would not come as a speech. It would come as a turn of a bow, a pause in muzzle flashes, and the next salvo that either fell short or landed home. The group commander held the last reports and refused to turn them into comfort. Aircraft overhead were seeing bends in the enemy formation, but bends could hide a new angle of attack. He focused on what he could still control. He ordered the escort carriers to keep building distance. He ordered them to keep launching aircraft whenever the wind allowed. He ordered the screen to keep laying smoke, not to hide forever, but to deny the enemy gunners a clean measure. He warned every ship against chasing anything into clear water. The escort carriers obeyed in the only way they could. Each captain ran, then turned into the wind long enough to throw more aircraft off the deck, then ran again. Deck crews worked around broken gear. They pushed aircraft by hand when machinery failed. They dragged hoses across slick planks when fragments cut lines. They kept the decks clear because a clear deck meant more aircraft in the air. Overhead, pilots ran out of weapons and then used their aircraft as threats. They dove even when they had little to drop, because a dive forced anti-aircraft fire and a turn of the helm. They stayed just close enough to keep the enemy captains uncertain. They did not need perfect hits. They needed the enemy to keep moving. Fuel became the next limit. Pilots called that they were low. Some asked for any deck that could take them. Some were told to wait because a carrier could not turn into the wind without exposing itself. Some were waved in for quick landings, while a captain accepted the risk. The air officers kept the cycle from collapsing, because if the cycle collapsed, the enemy heavy ships would get a clean run at the flight decks. Through breaks in smoke, the enemy line came into view again. The gun flashes were less frequent. The shell splashes were wider and less steady. An aircraft reported several large ships turning away from the chase in a scattered pattern. A surface ship reported the same change through its own smoke. The heavy ships were no longer driving straight in. Their bows were swinging. Their formation was opening instead of tightening. The commander acted on that change without declaring victory. He issued new work orders. Keep pressure from the air as long as fuel allows, but do not throw away aircraft in useless dives. Keep smoke between the carriers and the enemy, but do not let smoke hide friendly ships from each other. Pull the screen back toward the carriers as ships are able. Do not chase the heavy ships. Protect what is left. Those orders traveled in short transmissions and in flag hoists when radios were too busy. Captains repeated them in their own words, so their crews understood what changed. The goal was no longer to pry the enemy's aim off the carriers for another minute. The goal was to make separation real and to survive long enough to return to supporting later. A destroyer captain saw an opening and asked if he should chase the turning ships and finish the fight. The answer came back fast. Stay with the carriers. Do not cross beyond the smoke. Do not trade the last escorts for a chance that might be bait. Pilots overhead heard the same shift. They made a few last passes while fuel allowed, then broke off and climbed away. They did not linger to watch results. They turned toward the carriers or toward any deck that could take them. The pressure did not end in one moment. It thinned as fuel ran down and as the enemy ships widened the gap. As the screen pulled back, gaps opened that were made of losses, not of smoke. A captain looked across the water and did not see a ship he expected. He asked for a report and got none. He marked the absence and kept moving because stopping would put his own ship under the same guns. In the distance, Johnston was still fighting in and out of sight lines. Her movements were slower and her smoke thinner. Men who saw her through gaps could tell she had taken damage. They could also tell she was still drawing attention as long as she could. Evans kept Johnston in motion while it remained possible. He shifted through smoke breaks and used what firepower remained. When shells fell near, he turned. When they fell wide, he turned again. He kept making the enemy spend attention on a destroyer that refused to leave. The enemy continued to turn away, not as a neat line, but as a decision under pressure. Heavy guns did not stop at once. A few searching salvos still came in. Then, even those became rare. The distance widened. The enemy silhouettes faded back into weather. The escort carriers took advantage of every yard. Their captains stopped making wide turns and began to run steadier courses. Aircraft that had been circling with fuel near empty finally got landing signals. Wheels hit decks hard. Gear snapped taut. Deck crews folded wings and shoved aircraft clear so the next could come in. Not every aircraft made it. One pilot called that he could not reach a deck. The air officer gave him a heading and a calm set of instructions. A few minutes later, a surface ship saw an aircraft settle low and touch the sea. A raft popped. The ship did not stop immediately because the area was not safe. The captain marked the spot and came back when the shell splashes were farther away. Once the enemy heavy ships were no longer in immediate range, the commander authorized rescue. He did it in phases because a rescue ship that stopped too early could still be cut apart by a last salvo or by a cruiser that turned back for one more kill. A destroyer escort went first. Its captain slowed while his crew threw lines and nets. Men in the water saw the ship and started kicking and pushing rafts toward it. Some had been in the sea long enough that their hands were clumsy. Crewmen leaned out and grabbed wrists and belts and collars. They hauled men up in awkward lifts because there was no gentle way to pull a soaked body over a steel side. A sailor came up shaking and coughing. He tried to stand and his legs folded. A crewman wrapped him and dragged him clear of the rail so the next man could be pulled up. Another came up with oil in his hair and blood on his face. He kept asking for a name. The crewman answered with a task. Sit, drink, keep breathing. Medical men cut wet clothes off. They checked for shrapnel. They watched for men who had swallowed seawater. They put the worst cases flat and kept them from losing more heat. They kept moving because more hands were still reaching up. On one escort carrier, a muster list began. Names were called. Men answered. A line stayed silent. A petty officer marked the silence and moved to the next name. Aircraft still flew low patterns and searched for rafts and oil slicks. When a pilot saw survivors, he passed coordinates to the nearest ship that could break off. The escort carriers returned to the mission that had started the day. They turned into the wind again and kept launching, because Leyte still needed aircraft. Crews worked with fewer ships in the screen and less margin for error, but they kept the decks running. Word about Johnston came in fragments. One ship reported seeing her still firing. Another reported seeing her smoke thin and her speed fall away. No one in the group could turn back into the enemy direction to confirm everything. The commander kept his force moving because he had already spent too many small ships. Afterward, the United States Navy would record what the men had done in that morning's confusion. It would record that Ernest Evans had driven a destroyer into heavier guns and had forced turns that bought time. It would record that the escort carrier group had kept its flight decks alive long enough for the enemy to break contact. On that day, the proof was not in a record. The proof was in a carrier still launching aircraft and in men pulled alive over a rail. The group kept moving. Rescue ships circled back again and again. Behind them, the sea held debris, oil, and empty spaces where ships had been. The work continued anyway.